I'm Ed Gallagher, President of the American-Scandinavian Foundation, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you today's symposium. Collectors, Curators, and Connoisseurs discuss Munch and Warhol, which is presented in conjunction with the exhibition we have just opened in our third-floor galleries, Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Image. I think most of you are very familiar with the ASF, but I'm going to give it a plug anyway. Since our founding in 1911, the ASF's mission has been to promote international understanding through educational and cultural exchange between the U.S. and the 5 Nordic countries. This exchange is fostered through fellowships, cultural grants, internships, and a wide range of programs offered here at Scandinavia House, from concerts to film screenings, children's workshops, language classes, and of course exhibitions. In the 12 years since we opened Scandinavia House, the ASF has presented more than 50 exhibitions, and hopefully you've seen a few of them. Certainly I hope you have seen already or will shortly see Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Image. I will be introducing our speakers. I think you all have a program that lays out the agenda for the day. We have some wonderful speakers and we'll be moving along rather quickly. But before I do, I would like to express the great thanks we feel here to the many organizations and individuals who joined together in supporting this exhibition and lending art and organizing. And first I'd like to mention the Royal Norwegian Consulate General in New York, in particular Consul Sissel Brea and Consul Xenia Chrysostomadis, who is with us now, and Cultural Officer Ingrid Moe. They have been enormously supportive of all the educational programs that are being offered in conjunction with the exhibition, and we're most grateful. We also are very grateful for the support of Trond S. Jensen, Mr. and Mrs. Trond S. Jensen, who's with us today, as well as the Bergesen Foundation of Oslo, Martin E. Siegel, Kjersti and Bernd Reitan, and Nelson Blitz and Catherine Woodard, Barden Buenos Family Fund, and our chairman, Bente Svensson Frans, who is also here with us, and we're very pleased that she can be here. SAS Scandinavian Airlines was provided or contributed all of the transportation for works coming from Norway, which is invaluable. The exhibition is made possible to a large extent by the generosity of the lenders, both abroad and in the U.S., a few of whom are here today, including Nelson Blitz and Sally Epstein, whom you'll be hearing from shortly. We also were very fortunate in having loans from the Ronald Feldman Fine Arts and Jordan Schnitzer Family Collection. And from Norway, Henriette Dedekind was a generous lender and also provided advice to the curators in the organization of the exhibition. I think right now I'd like to get the program going, and I'd like to first invite, we have the great pleasure of having two movers behind the Munch 150 celebration, and I should mention that this exhibition is presented as part of the commemoration of Munch's 150th birthday, which is being fully celebrated in Oslo this year. And the two major forces behind that are Stein Olav Henrichsen, the director of the Munch Museum, and Audun Eckhoff, the director of the National Museum of Art, Architecture, and Design. They're both here with us today, and they will tell us a little about the Munch 150 celebration. We'd first hear from Audun Eckhoff, who it's a real pleasure to welcome because he is a former fellow of the ASF. He received funding from us to study at the International Studio Curator and whatever program, ISCP. He has, since that time, gone on to be a curator at the Contemporary Museum in Oslo, director of the Bergen Museum, and now in his present position, director of the National Museum of Art, Architecture, and Design. Please welcome Audun Eckhoff.
Dear friends of the ASF, first, on behalf of the National Museum of Norway and the Munch 150, I would like to express my sincere respect and gratitude to the American-Scandinavian Foundation for organizing the exhibition Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Image. This event is a great contribution to the celebration of the 150th anniversary of Edvard Munch. There is a long tradition of strong ties between America and Norway, within history and politics. Within the field of visual arts, however, the connection is not all that obvious. The exhibition Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Image shows us both an interesting and surprising relation between a Norwegian and an American artist. Surprising, perhaps, because we tend to perceive Munch as an introvert, even oversensitive artist, heavily associated with illness and death, and Warhol, on the other side, as a cool and surface-oriented artist as businessman. This exhibition leads us to appreciate a much closer relation between these artists than their self-staged personas should lead us to believe in the first place. The spectacular sale of the Scream in New York last year itself made a perfect teaser for the Munch anniversary. The subsequent small but exquisite MoMA exhibition, now in its final days, is equally a very positive contribution to the Munch year. I can confess that I had the privilege, on behalf of the Norwegian cultural authorities, to give the formal go-ahead for the international sale of this precious cultural item. After I did, the Norwegian Broadcasting interviewed more than 20 independent art experts in order to find somebody who meant that this was a scandal and that the work should remain within Norwegian ownership, but they found nobody. Recognized as one of the masters of modern art, Edvard Munch's work is not as well represented in many museums worldwide as many other modern masters of the same artistic level. Actually, everybody interviewed by the Broadcasting agreed that, contrary to a scandal, a sale would provide an opportunity for Munch to be even more appreciated and known internationally. In Norway, we were all very happy when the painting turned up in MoMA. We certainly hope it will return there later on as well and strengthen Munch's representation in this center of modern art, and perhaps encourage art lovers to go to Norway and see more of Edvard Munch's art. The little exhibition in MoMA and the intimate and exquisite comparison between Munch and Warhol here at the ASF both express interesting but separate aspects of Edvard Munch's art. In the great anniversary exhibition, due to open in Oslo June the 1st, we will show not a specific theme, but rather try to make a comprehensive overview. This presentation will provide a chronological narrative of Munch's work from his debut in the 1880s until his death in 1944. The first part of this exhibition will be shown in the National Gallery. The second part, which shows the later work of Munch, will be shown in the Munch Museum. All as part of the same comprehensive show. It will be the largest show of Munch ever presented, including an almost complete presentation of the Frieze of Life, his most famous long-time undertaking. Along the way, the exhibition will sidestep into particular themes in Munch's oeuvre, such as self-portraits and landscapes and other themes. Special attention will be paid to Munch's visual rhetoric, how Munch expressed himself in order to achieve his characteristic effects on the viewer. In other words, how he managed to give his great subjects their convincing and compelling form, because we all know that we can associate content, illness, death, trouble, anxiety with Munch. But how did he actually manage to give this a compelling form that gives such a great impression on everybody? Because I think it's a common notion that, contrary to some of the other modern masters, Munch goes directly to the heart, to everybody, scholar and not scholar. In contrast to the conception of Munch as a somewhat miserable and depressed artist, the exhibition will present him as a self-conscious, assertive artist, very much aware of his talent from his early youth on, through a long and creative life. Munch 150, the anniversary exhibition, is a great undertaking which will take place only in Oslo. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, you may have to make the trip to Oslo in order to see it. We welcome you to Oslo from June to mid-October for this great event. Please don't wait too long. The exhibition is the single most important element in the celebration of Edvard Munch's anniversary. But throughout the year, there will be many more events celebrating this artist. And I now give the floor to my colleague, or to Ed first, I think, to tell you more about this. Please, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to express, on behalf of the Munch Museum, our deepest gratitude to Ed Gallagher and the Scandinavia House for launching this fantastic exhibition of Munch and Warhol, and also to do this symposium this evening and allow us to be able to present aspects of our anniversary, 150 years since Edvard Munch was born. First of all, I'd like to say, because you might not know a lot about the Munch Museum, so I'll say a few words about the museum. As you might know, Edvard Munch testamented all his works to the city of Oslo. He wrote his testament in 1940, in fact 1 week after the Nazis invaded Norway. But he died in 1944, and then the city of Oslo received 28,000 artworks and 15 other museum objects. 200 lithographic stones, his sketchbooks, his library, his photo archive, his press archive, and lots of other things, tools, 1,000 painting tubes, for example, and other working tools. So it's a vast collection. And of course we have a lot of dealings with museums all over the world, and we feel that particularly now during the anniversary there's a lot of attention on Edvard Munch, also in the aftermath of the sale of the Scream here in New York last year, and also some fantastic exhibition we have had all over Europe the latest year, which has been drawing great attention and great number of audiences. So the museum in Oslo is entirely dedicated to the works of Edvard Munch, and we are in the process also of building a new museum. So you might have read about the problems in Oslo concerning that everybody wants to have a new museum, but we can't decide where we want to have the new museum. So in the meantime we stay at Tøyen, where we have been for 50 years now, and you're very welcome to come there, and that's where the last part of this exhibition that my colleague Audun Eckhoff presented to you a few minutes ago. I'd like to draw your attention to a few other things happening in the anniversary, and of course I cannot take you into everything because it's more than 150 different activities happening around the globe, and of course a lot in Norway. But I'd like to to put your attention to a few things. But if you'd like to know more about the anniversary, you might go to the homepage of the anniversary, which is called munch150.no. So that's where you can find out everything if you like. First of all, the anniversary exhibition is emphasized on his paintings. But you might know that Edvard Munch also worked in a lot of other formats and forms and other expressions. So we decided to emphasize after this anniversary exhibition at the Munch Museum in the fall, when the anniversary exhibition ends on the 13th of October. We start on 1st of November, emphasizing his paper works. That's graphic works, that's his drawings, it's his watercolors, and his woodcuts, of course. And we will also include a lot of his working tools and techniques, because we can also then get to know how Edvard Munch was continuously researching new technical possibilities in order to even get further into the themes and the problems and the aspects that he wanted to discuss with us and share with us. So one interesting aspect also in this exhibition, I think, is the fact that we, for the first time, and we are very honored and proud to be able to do that, are displaying his 200 sketchbooks. In these 200 sketchbooks there will be 4,500 drawings, and we have been able to digitalize this, so you can actually go through everything and see everything, and that's the first time, of course, that happens, so we are very happy about that. So I think that's also going to be a highlight of the anniversary, this attention on his paperworks. Then a couple of other things. As you might know, Edvard Munch were living different places around the fjord in Oslo, so we have a few places, 8 in fact, that's called Munch communities, and they have different relationships to Edvard Munch and his life and his works. And there are particularly 3 places this year that has been organized in a way that you can actually experience these places and go into Edvard Munch's landscapes. That's first of all Hvitsten, which in fact Peter Olsen, who sold the Scream, the former owner of the Scream, is renewing Edvard Munch's property and also building a museum at Hvitsten. So that's a wonderful place to see some of the landscapes that Munch is using in his works. On the other side of the fjord, we have 2 other places, Kragerø, where the sun, for example, were anticipated, and also Åsgårdstrand, which Munch lived for many years and worked for many summers, and where you really can walk into his landscapes, his shores. The place looks exactly like it did when Munch was there, so you can really feel that you are in his life, so to speak. So there are these 8 communities, and they have lots of activities and possibilities to experience Munch in certain ways. Then a couple of other things I'd like to mention to you, because one thing that we are also very proud of being able to now is to launch a new book for children to present Edvard Munch and his art to children. This will be in 6 languages and being worldwide distributed. So there is a few, we have almost 20 new publications about Munch this year, and I like particularly this possibility to have a modern and new book for children, but also the 2 catalogs for the exhibition that Mr. Eckhoff mentioned, and also the paper work exhibition will have catalogs that will be worldwide distributed in several languages. So that's another thing I would like to draw your attention to. The last thing I want to mention is that we now are able to finally launch a new documentary on Edvard Munch. You might know that Peter Watkins did a dramatization of Edvard Munch's earlier years in 76 or 7, I think. But now we are really launching an international documentary on the life and works of Edvard Munch to be released in the autumn and be for sale also in our bookstores and on the internet. So that's one thing I also look very much forward to myself, and I also like to invite you to experience that. So that's what I wanted to say about the anniversary. I really hope that you will be able to enjoy some of the things that we are presenting this year, and maybe you even are able to come to Norway, and I wish you very, very welcome if you do, and I would very much like to see you at our museums. So have a great anniversary, Edvard Munch anniversary year, and thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Patricia Berman, and for those of you who may not be aware, she is the co-curator of Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Image, which she jointly curated with Parry Stave. Dr. Berman is a great friend of the foundation, and we're very fortunate that she has been a great advisor and participant in a number of our projects. She's an art historian specializing in art and visual culture of the late 19th, 20th, and 21st century. She is a Theodora and Stanley H. Feldberg Professor of Art and the Chair of the Art Department at Wellesley College, and she is also on the faculty at the University of Oslo's Institute of Philosophy, the History of Ideas, Art History, and Classical Studies, where she is part of a research project entitled Edvard Munch, Modernity and Meditation. Her research interests include the turn of the 20th century European art, especially in Scandinavia, and mid-century modern American painting and photography. Pat is particularly interested in national identity formation, issues of gender and sexuality, and in the problems of public space. She has received numerous awards and fellowships, and most notably, we'd like to point out that she has received 2 fellowships from the American-Scandinavian Foundation, and that was in 1984 and 85. She has been a member of our ASF Committee on Fellowships and Grants since 1992, and she has been an advisory trustee of the ASF since 2012. Her curatorial work is extensive, and again, with great pride, we point to Luminous Modernism, Scandinavian Art Comes to America, a Centennial Retrospective, which was mounted by the ASF on the occasion of our centennial in 2011. Just before that, she was a co-curator on the exhibition in Oslo entitled In Munch's Laboratory, The Path to the Aula, which was presented at the Munch Museum. She was also the curator of I'm not sure how we say this, co-curated Edvard Munch at the Museum of Modern Art, Edvard Munch and the Modern Life of the Soul, 2006. Cold War Modern was an exhibition she curated at Wellesley in 2001, and then Edvard Munch, Image and Myth, 1997. In 1995, she curated Modern Hieroglyphs, Gestural Drawing, and European Vanguard. And her whole curatorial career, I guess, began with Northern Light, Realism and Symbolism in Scandinavian Painting, 1880 to 1910, in which she worked closely with Kurt Varnado, and which I think led to her interest in Edvard Munch and Scandinavian art. She is currently working on our next exhibition here at Scandinavia House, which is entitled From the Golden Age to the Modern Breakthrough, Danish Paintings from the collection of Ambassador John L. Loeb, Jr., and that will be opening in early October. But for now, it's a great pleasure to welcome her to the stage, and I also want to express my great gratitude and admiration for everything she's done to make this exhibition possible, along with Perry. So please, Pat, the podium is all yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm Pat Berman. I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, but I'd like to say a few things off the clock if I could. And the first is, Ed has already given tremendous thanks to many of you who are in the audience who were lenders to the exhibition and supporters of the exhibition. But I also wanted to thank so much my co-curator, my partner, Perry Stave, and also members of the staff of the American-Scandinavian Foundation, Ariana Tiziani, Kyle Reinhardt, Lynn Carter, Claire Whitman, Kate Henrichsen, Victoria McGann, and Edward Gallagher for supporting this at and many others. It took a very significant village to make this gem, what feels like a gem of an exhibition. Edvard Munch and Andy Warhol are occasionally brought together only to make the claim that there's nothing that they have in common, and I'm just showing you the cover of Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism, an article that was first released in 1984, the year that Warhol made the prints that we're looking at upstairs, in which Jameson, the literary critic, made the claim that to define postmodernism, one needs to take modernist artists who are utopian and inwardly looking, such as Munch, and understand them as somehow generating new ideas, and then take someone like Warhol, who's all about commercialism and superficiality and capitalist enterprise, and you see them as polar opposites. So the two have been brought together, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally, only to show that they're completely different. And there, thank you. But in the early 1980s, the two were brought together for very different purposes, and that's the function of this exhibition and what we'll be talking about today. In 1982, Gallery Berman, which was a short-lived gallery on 57th Street here in Manhattan, held a large-scale Munch exhibition with about 126 works of art, so large exhibition. Warhol visited the exhibition, and in 1983, the gallery commissioned Warhol to paint 15 paintings based on Munch's motifs. Warhol chose these 4 as the starting point for paintings about Munch. The Brooch from 1903, version of Madonna from the mid-1890s, Munch's self-portrait from the mid-1890s, and the Scream, likewise from the mid-1890s, all 4 of them lithographs. Warhol completed the paintings, and they were sold very quickly within a matter of months, and in 1984, the gallery commissioned Warhol to make a print series based on the 4 motifs, which Warhol did. Which were created initially to be multiplied and put into portfolios, and then the portfolios sold as multiples. But in the end, the prints that were made as trial proofs, which we see upstairs, remained singular. The portfolios were never created, so each of the prints that you see is a trial proof, is singular. So in a sense, what Warhol created for this series were singular multiples, or multiple singularities. So I'm showing you here the transformation from the small, intimate, inwardly looking, deeply symbolic works by Munch to those, I think, also deeply symbolic in some ways, works by Warhol. There we go. So in the 1980s, as many of you know, and as we will hear later on this afternoon, because there are Warhol experts in the room, so I speak with some shyness, Warhol took all kinds of commissions, was commissioned to do all kinds of work, including Absolute Vodka, portfolios of prints after the prints of Audubon. And he was commissioned again and again to do old master appropriations, such as the works of Paolo Uccello, Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, and Giorgio de Chirico, among others. And he appropriated and he appropriated and he appropriated and he digested and he put out an endless sort of cycle of these recycled images in the 1980s. And the Munch Commission was one of those, was a commission by a commercial gallery to do those productions. And in many ways, Munch's works can be seen as ready-mades. And actually, in some sense, in one sense, Warhol treated Munch's images almost as ready-mades. And of course, I'm showing you here in the center of all of this Marcel Duchamp's LHOOQ from 1919, in which he put a Marcel Duchamp, a little mustache, a little beard, and this very rude statement. She has a hot behind, politely said, down beneath a cheap reproduction of Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Appropriating, taking something from the past, investing yourself in a new way on the surface and making new meanings. So in some senses, what Warhol did with the works of the 80s that he appropriated was just this. He used the works as ready-made objects. And the thing we do know about Warhol and that we think about when we think about Warhol is his practice of repetition and seriality. And within repetition and seriality, often strange, very subtle differences in repetition and in reproduction. And in his Warhol's Maryland diptych I'm blocking the slide, I'm sorry, Maryland diptych from 1962, one of the things that is notable and surprising and extremely interesting about it is the fact that he took a publicity photograph of the actress Marilyn Monroe, the screen goddess, just after her death, and repeated it and repeated it and repeated it in this grid, in color, in black and white, using a screen print technique. And each one varies slightly from each other one, using the accident of silkscreen printing, the accident of screen printing with some hand amendments, to call our attention to this notion of celebrity culture, about how pictures are repeated and are circulated through culture, how we think we know something because we see its representation, and how the repeated representations of a single person or a single theme or a single image become part of our collective consciousness, and yet all of the accidents and differences here make faulty that idea that we can really know a subject through its representation. You know, Munch, too, is known for his repetitions and his variations and his seriality for very different ways and for very different means, and we'll be hearing more about that in a little while, in part from collectors of Munch's work who live with Munch's work and know it intimately. But upstairs in the gallery are variations on Madonna, and you can see that it's terrible to see them degraded in slides, but there they are upstairs with some subtle differences. Munch kept going back into and reworking his lithographics, and this is a intaglio print here on the left, but the others are stones that have been reworked where there's subtle differences, where for example, the spectacular spermatozoa that frames the image along with a little fetus imaging the Christian Sacred Mother, who's seen from the perspective perhaps of a man making love to her. So a woman in ecstasy, a woman at the moment of conception, bringing together sexuality, biology, and Christian sacrality all in the same image, surrounded by spermatozoa that start to multiply in some of the prints. She grows extra hair in some of the prints. In some versions, the sensational frame is taken away entirely, so it just becomes a figure. So this notion of going back into and looking at differences and extracting new meanings through repetition is something that Munch is known for as well. And one of the things that we forget is how sometimes these repetitions are occasioned by silent partners. And showing you the 1893 version of the screen here on the left, which is in the National Museum of Art, Architecture, and Design in Oslo. The pastel from 1895 that was created 2 years after this, that's still hanging at MoMA. The lithographic version of the scream from the same year, from 1895, that we have in our gallery upstairs, and then from 1910 or so, another painting version of the scream. And when I say silent partners, I will say a little bit about this, but we'll be hearing more later. Sometimes Munch's repetitions, as Warhol's repetitions, were occasioned by commissions. The 1895 version of the scream, in fact, was commissioned by a German collector who asked to have a version of the scream. Munch generated that for him. And without the silent partner of the collector, this wouldn't have come into being. Munch created the lithographic version of the scream, and in fact, many of his prints, based on requests, well, this not necessarily, but sometimes based on request by people who were interested in seeing the repetitions. Munch began to pull prints in part, make prints, at the suggestion of one critic and one collector who thought that he might be able to get his motifs out there in the marketplace much further than simply making a single painting. So in a sense, collectors and the marketplace are silent partners, not so silent sometimes to Edvard Munch. And in the end, Munch, when this painting was sold to an Oslo collector, the 1893 version of the scream, the 1910 version came into being when Munch painted this version for himself. So again, collectors are often silent partners and conjure things into being that we're unaware of, and we'll be hearing about that as our collectors of Munch speak a little later. It's not so unusual to create printed versions of your paintings. It's not so unusual in the 19th century to use prints to permeate the market with your imagery. And I'm showing you here Jean-François Millet's The Sower from 1850. It was his breakthrough painting, and it was so exciting for him that it was a breakthrough painting, and he was so conscious of market that he made a lithographic version in 1851, and then in the mid-1860s, prompted by collectors, he made pastel after pastel after pastel. So the world is actually permeated with Millet's original sowers, even though they're repetitions. They're not necessarily original. In all of these repetitions, we think about, and we're familiar with Claude Monet's Rouen Cathedral series, as many of Monet's series from 1892 to 94 here. Artists work with repetition and variations on the theme all the time. And so when Munch was doing his variations, it was part of a production system within European art. And when Warhol did his, of course, it was well established, and of course I just couldn't help but show Roy Lichtenstein's version of Rouen Cathedral, which he created, which in part through silkscreen, in part through hand painting of the Ben-Day dots. This from 1969. Commentaries on seriality and repetition and photomechanical reproduction in the hands of Lichtenstein. I want to go for a moment into one of Munch's motifs to talk about how Warhol redid it. This spectacular portrait, entitled The Brooch, is a portrait of Eva Madocci, who was a violinist. She was British born. I'm showing you a photograph of hers here on the right-hand side of the screen. She was born British as Evangeline Muddock, and was a part of her repertoire included Scandinavian music, so she traveled along with her life partner and accompanist Bella Edwards, and this is another lithograph by Munch of the two of them together. And Munch and she came into each other's lives in 1903, and he made several images of her, one of them with her partner, and then one of them from 1903, somewhat spectacularly and deeply pathetically with his own sort of symbolic self-portrait tucked under her chin like a violin. And so there's a lot of stories to tell, and perhaps Sarah Epstein will talk a little bit about her as we go forward. I wanted to take a moment to look at how Warhol looked at this print. When you look carefully at how Warhol looked at the prints and how he made his prints, we start to, I think we see things that we may not have seen before in Munch's work. What Warhol's technique was, and we'll hear more about this later in greater detail, was to take the image, and this is what he did in the early 1980s when he was commissioned by the gallery. He requested reproductions of the prints themselves. So Warhol didn't begin with the live prints by Munch, but by photomechanical reproductions that he then enlarged, had blown up, photographed, re-enlarged, and then traced. And I'm showing, this is one of the works in our gallery, a large-scale work, in which Warhol has traced or made up lines that represent here the brooch. And I think this should work. Yeah. So when you look at the, if you were to imagine overlaying the gigantic Warhol onto the very intimate print of the brooch, you begin to see that what Warhol did was sort of traced Munch's own lines in some areas. I'm sorry, this is slightly out of register, but maybe that's appropriate for Warhol. But in other areas, he completely invented things. He made up lines where Munch didn't produce them. He took tremendous liberties, and he turned these into Warhol gestural drawings in one way or another. So, of course, Warhol's work isn't the same as Munch's work. And when you, then what he did was blew that up and then turned it into a kind of a stencil, the drawings themselves, onto a silk screen, as well as having produced areas that would provide the background work based on Munch's prints, photomechanicals, and then layer after layer was printed to create the remarkable color effects that we see. And what we end up seeing in the prints is Munch's underlayer, the photomechanical reproduction of Munch's print itself, with Warhol's gestures in many ways on the surface. We'll hear more about that. So we see, in a way, two artists in one as we look at the prints. And of course, instead of the Victorian violinist, who was a live human being in 1903, we now see a celebrity portrait. In many ways, I think that the works that Warhol chose to appropriate maybe go in line with other of his celebrity portraiture, repetitions of other great beauties and important people from history in the present day. The thing is that I would like to say about the technique too is that in silkscreen printing, and as in any printing with lithographic stones, when you're trying to print color over color over color, and I'm just showing you a random silk screen I pulled off the internet. When you put down one color layer, it's really important then when you attach the next screen with the next color layer to register them so that they're absolutely in sync, one on top of another, right? Because there's layer upon layer building up, making a solid form. It's really hard to do, and over the course of the history of silk screening, many kinds of mechanical processes have been done to kind of lay down one screen and print and then lift it up and lay another in perfect registration. So you end up with something that looks like a cornflake cereal box, which is one of the first applications of silk screening in the early 20th century, was commercial printing. But one of the things that Warhol took immense delight in making these particular prints that we see, is printing out of registration. So when you look at the prints, and I'm showing you the spectacular version of Warhol's Scream after Munch, in this series after Munch, in which there are the figures been repeated a couple of times, one in red and one with this white overlay like a ghost. In fact, there are so many things out of registration in the Warhol prints that you recognize that it in itself is an aesthetic. And it turns, for example, the Scream into something that literally vibrates before your eyes, which is maybe an amplification of Munch's intention in the first place in translating the colored paintings into a black and white lithograph with all of the lines moving in different directions, eccentrically suggesting this sort of collision of visual experience with oral experience. And one of the things that we think about when we think about Warhol is the fact that, and we look at these prints, is that Warhol collaborated with a master printer, Rupert Jason Smith, and in the end it may have been Smith, we'll go back in a moment to look at the prints, who made the color decisions, who did the lack of registration, who did the experimental application, because it was Smith who actually printed the singular prints that we have upstairs. And when we ask questions about, well, then who is the artist, who actually touched the prints, who's the author, we have to remind ourselves that the history of collaboration and a lack of artist touch is something that's part of 19th century art, part of art history. But from Munch's own cultural experience, Knud Bergslien, who is an immensely popular artist, nationalist painter of the mid-19th century in Norway, created this image of the Birkebeiners, these Vikings saving a young king, skiing across Norway to establish the legitimate throne. It was such a popular painting, he did multiple oil versions of this, and then he created a lithographic version and had a workshop of people hand coloring them, which then got dispersed in Norway. It was a great national emblem. So the artist may not have touched his own work much at all in the dispersal of the prints, but they're still his prints. And I remind us of Auguste Rodin, the great French sculptor, who probably didn't lay a finger on many of the works that left his studio. So this idea of the silent collaborators, the workshop, others making aesthetic decisions, others bringing things into being, is something that's very much part of art culture. Some artists hide that fact, and others, like Warhol, make it explicit. I want to finish by saying a few other little things, and that is when we look at Warhol's version of the self-portrait here on the left, self-portrait with skeleton arm after Munch, and side by side with Munch's lithographic self-portrait. You know, there are many formal things that you'll notice in the galleries that make the two very distinctive, including the huge size of this one and the rather intimate size of this one in real life. And one of the things I find so interesting is that it's still a self-portrait by Munch, self-portrait after Munch. And I'm always perplexed by this because, of course, Warhol produced it, so it's not a self-portrait. It's a portrait of another. It's a portrait of a celebrity. And yet, I think the two commingle on the surface. The two commingle in many kinds of ways because Munch's print, which has been photomechanically reproduced, blown up, rephotographed, reproduced, blown up again, and reproduced and turned into a silkscreen, is present as a reproduction. As you look carefully at the print, you'll see all of the evidence of a degraded photomechanical reproduction, all the little dots that become very apparent, and at the same time, these very solid aluminum lines, metallic printed lines over the surface. You become so aware of the photomechanical Munch and the gestural Warhol together on the surface. It's an image that in many ways reminds me of Warhol's collaboration with Jean-Michel Basquiat in 1983 to 84. Basquiat, of course, the young New York artist whom Warhol sort of adopted, and the two collaborated on sequences of art in which one would paint the base of a composition and the other would sort of graffiti over the top. And so therefore they were producing overtly collaborative works, the younger artist and the older artist together. And I, in some senses, end up seeing Warhol's gestural work on top of Munch in that regard, like graffiti on the surface. So yes, absolutely, this was Munch's work was kind of like a ready-made for Warhol, like Duchamp. But I do see it's not just a ready-made, and it's just not a photomechanical reproduction, but I think that it turns into, and I think this Munch series that Warhol produced, turned into a more personal kind of enterprise, because as we'll hear potentially later, there are many more points of convergence in the artist's ways of thinking and careers than one might at first imagine. And of course, the self-portrait was not interesting just to Warhol and may or may not have held personal meanings for him, but it surely did of other artists of his moment. Jasper Johns, several years earlier in his sequence of prints of the Sovereign Can, where there's an arm that's reproduced down below, and other sort of cryptic references within references, to his own studio and art making. And then Robert Mapplethorpe's self-portrait here, his face popping out of darkness, holding here the death's head cane. These are all artists who saw Munch in different ways and thought about Munch in different ways, and there are many more from this generation, sort of the 70s and 80s, who did. Munch spoke differently to each generation as he speaks to us. And in the end, we don't know precisely what Warhol extracted for himself out of this particular commission. I think he was brilliant in the way that he interpreted and reinterpreted and reimagined Munch. and particularly in his decision, as you see upstairs, to create a marriage portrait, or however you want to constitute it, of Madonna and the self-portrait together, which creates a kind of a funny, holy family when seen with this little fetus, a kind of a strange conjunction, whatever it means. It's a reinvention, and by reinventing these motifs, we see them differently. I see them differently. When I move from gallery to gallery, I see Munch through absolutely fresh eyes. I see him a little through Warhol's eyes. And in the end, these images side by side of Madonna and the self-portrait remind me too of Warhol's retrospective series, a series of paintings that he did in 1979, in which he took his older images, his iconic images, his heavily repeated and maybe by then even drained of meaning images from the 60s, and superimposed them one above another. In the end, what Warhol's project was in many ways was a retrospective of Munch. Bringing the two, Madonna and the self-portrait, together in one print becomes a print retrospective. Our exhibition is so much about printmaking as printmaking. And as I began with this Gallery Berman exhibition from 1982, the generation point, the commercial generating point for the prints we see upstairs, I want to call attention to the fact that maybe Warhol was very cagey about any exhibition of any artist being a retrospective. So now we're looking at Warhol's work in retrospect, Munch's work in retrospect, and now we can go forward and hear from people who live with these works and who think about them deeply every day. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon. I'm Liz Prelinger, as Mr. Gallagher just said, and I've got two of the preeminent collectors of Munch's prints in America and worldwide sitting next to me. Sarah G., Sally Epstein, and Nelson Blitz Jr. Sally is from Washington and Nelson from New York. So it's a great privilege to have these, what Pat called sort of silent partners of the Munch story. Sally has the Epstein Foundation collection, has a collection of about 300 Munch prints, and she has also received the Order of St. Olav for introducing Edvard Munch widely and also in the US. And Nelson Blitz owns a collection of around 30 Munch prints of the very highest quality, including one that is absolutely 100% unique, incredibly rare for prints. So I thought I'd start with sort of the obvious questions to both of you, which is how you got involved with Munch prints in the first place. When did you see your first one? What struck you? Sally?
Is this on? Are you hearing
Yes.
me? Well, this was back in 1950 in Boston, Massachusetts. I was going to Simmons School of Social Work, and I was dating a young man from MIT. He grew up and loved jazz and modern art, and I had not been exposed to very much in that order. And one day he said to me, "I'm going to take you to an exhibition of a Norwegian artist, Edvard Munch." And I said, "I would be delighted." So we went, and it was an exhibition both of oil paintings and prints. And I must say, when I walked into that exhibition, he was my artist for life. I never varied after that. And I guess I would say that the reason was that everything I saw on that wall spoke to me, human emotions, human situations. And when I bought the hardback catalog for, I think it was $4.75, and read about his life, I realized that he was showing us his life and sharing his life with us, the viewers.
So I started much different than Sally. I came from a middle-class Jewish family on the West Side, even though my mother wasn't Jewish. And I never went to a museum in my life. I went to a college where people went to art history courses, and I didn't understand why they were doing that. And then I went in the Army. I was in ROTC TC, and I went to Germany, and I never knew there was a German museum, nor did I learn how to speak German, so I was a little behind the curve. In 1969, I moved to a real apartment in New York City next to the Guggenheim. I never went in the Guggenheim, and I lived there for 5 years. So essentially, until I started collecting art in 1971 for decoration, I was still trying to go to baseball and basketball games. I was an athlete and not an intellectual. So my first 4 or 5 things were mistakes. They were big, awful color prints of Murot, Chagall, I don't even remember, Picasso, and some nice Toulouse-Lautrecs. So I went to an auction in 1972, and there were 500 things, and I liked 500 of them, which is kind of strange, I guess. One was an Edvard Munch, and I walked up to it. I had never heard of Edvard Munch. And I said to Mark Rosen, who was head of the Sotheby's print department, "Who's this?" And he said, "Edvard Munch." And I said, "Who?" And that's basically when I thought, hey, this is a pretty cool guy. And I went up to Boston immediately, and I went to an exhibition up there. And I finally went, when I was 32 years old, to other galleries and to MoMA, who happened to have a collection of Edvard Munch. So with him, initially, it was instant chemistry.
Thank you. Sally, can you tell us something about how your collection was formed and how you started out once you saw those images at the Institute for Contemporary Art? How did it turn into what it is today?
Well, we certainly didn't become collectors immediately. When I met my former husband, Lionel Epstein, he was at Harvard Law School, and I discovered he also had seen the same exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Boston. So we had that very much in common. We happened to know Sergeant Shriver through the experiment in international living, and when he formed the Peace Corps, he asked us to sail on student ships going and coming from Europe to see whether young Americans would be interested in joining the Peace Corps. We had had 2 Norwegian au pairs to help with our children at that point, so between sailings, we went to visit them in Norway, and of course saw Munchs not only in the museums, but in private homes of people that we went to see. When we came back, Alan Frumpkin's gallery in New York was having a sale of Mies van der Rohe's collection, and there were some extra prints in that collection by Gene Summers, who was a student of Mies, and he decided to try to sell his Munch prints at the same time. My husband didn't tell me, but he went to New York on business, went to see the exhibit. He took me back to see the exhibit the next weekend, but again didn't tell me he had reserved 3 of Gene Summers' prints, and he produced them over the time, my birthday and probably Christmas and Mother's Day or something of that sort. At any rate, that was the beginning. And from then on, we just plunged in. We knew Alan Fern at the Library of Congress, who got catalogs from all over Europe when prints were on sale, and many of them had Munch prints for sale. He advised us on what we might bid, and often in those days, you would get 8 or 10 Munch prints as a lot, not as separate prints. And so our collecting started to build up very, very quickly in the early 1960s.
And you've been collecting ever since. Are you still continuing?
Yes, but on a very limited basis. Because I know so much about Edvard Munch, if a very small etching, perhaps, of a woman comes on the market, it's not something that a museum would like for its only Munch print. But we would perhaps send in a bid because I know who the woman is, and in that way we occasionally still get Munch prints.
Hey, that actually brings up things that I'll ask you in a few minutes. It's very interesting. Nelson, how about you in terms of your collecting philosophy? Because I know also that you've gone in different directions, as well as having your solid core of extraordinary Munch prints. How would you describe your trajectory?
Well, in 1964, I went to Norway, and I visited the Kon-Tiki Museum, the Fram Museum, the Viking Museum in Vigeland Park, and obviously I didn't know who Edvard Munch was, so I think the museum had just been built. So when I get to 1972 and I saw this Edvard Munch, I really liked it. It was the it was Into the Woods, the Zumwalt, a late one, 1915 or so, or the latest one, other than Liz when she did her catalog of my collection and Sally's in Washington. She transforms the dates and through color when these things were actually done. So I started to collect Munch, and I went to Sally's house in Washington. I went to Phil's house, and they were a little ahead of me. And since I was sort of the younger one, there was Alan Press. I wasn't in the Munch Mafia. So I started to collect Munch very cautiously. The first one I bought, I went to Kornfeld in 1973, and I was the underbidder, and I was amazed that someone could outbid me because I was a collector, and why would a dealer outbid me? But not only did the dealer outbid me, and I kept going up in price, he then sold it to me a year later. So that's how crazy I was. So I started to collect Munch, but over the years, and I was a single person, I think what influenced me most about art, and to this day, is I was going out with a woman, and she was an art historian from Oxford University, and one day she said to me, "You know, you don't know anything about art." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, I'm on the acquisition committee at the Met in MoMA." So she said, "Well, who's Caravaggio?" And I said, "Who?" And then she said, "Who's Ang?" And I said, "Who?" So I went immediately up to the Art Institute, which was 4 blocks where I lived. Maybe I had by then 10 Munchs, 5 or 6 Kirchners, a Jasper Johns collection, a Picasso collection, a little Matisse collection, and a lot of stuff that I don't have anymore. And I always bought, like dating, it was instant chemistry. After 20 minutes, I knew I liked 20 seconds, and if I hesitated any longer than that, I was unhappy a month later when I had it. So I went up to the Institute. They said, "You can't come here. You have no art history." So I went up to Columbia, went for 2 years to general studies. Then I applied to the graduate school, and I walked into my class, my first real class in graduate school, and I saw this lady in this huge class, and I married her. So, forgetting, she's not here today, she's in North Carolina, and we have similar tastes, but I guess I go back and forth between Munch and Kirchner. I like to know about the lives of them, and Picasso and Jasper Johns, and I guess at this point in my life, I really can't decide who I like the most of any of these artists, and I'm really honest about that. I had my 70th birthday party in Kirchner's house in Davos. He had 2, not in the one where he committed suicide, in the other one. And I go back to Edvard Munch, but I like the idea that he did different states. I like the major images, but I think maybe because I finally learned a little about art and I became friendly with art historians and directors of museums and just not baseball players like I wanted to be, that I think there's a whole world out there in collecting, and it goes, I'm not disparaging Munch, I really like Edvard Munch, but there's a whole world out there that I still look at and try to understand. I was greatly influenced being on the committee with the Strausses in MoMA that I never looked at Jasper Johns. To me, he was a contemporary artist, and he didn't have a face in it. And one day, Reva Castleman took me down by Katz's Delicatessen to Johns' studio, and it had an Edvard Munch monotype. And I said, "So what?" But it had the Edvard Munch skeleton arm, So that was his self-portrait with the Saffron can, and I bought it. And from there, I became much more obsessional about Jasper Johns for 15 or 20 years than Munch. So I just think you always learn, and there's a new discovery every day.
Yes, thank you. That, by the way, was the image that Pat showed us of the Saffron can that Jasper Johns had done, so that you had that strong reaction to. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay, good. Sally, that brings up to me your particular philosophy of collecting and your particular interest in Munch, which goes way beyond the works of art themselves. But you've spent many, many years now tracking down family, friends, models, and doing a whole project of interviewing people who knew Munch or knew some of these connections, and I think everyone would love to hear more about that interviewing project. And if you can include the one about Eva Mudoci as well, that would be utterly fascinating.
All right. Because I realized that Munch was picturing his own life in his works, I wondered about some of the people that he had done portraits of, and what was Munch really like? Was he the curmudgeon, the withdrawn person that many historians talked about? Had he really had a nervous breakdown, or was it some other kind of a situation? So I started in Norway, really through the Munch Museum, finding out some of the people that were still alive. And from one person to another, I interviewed, for example, 3 of his models. I interviewed his gardener. I interviewed the son of his doctor. I interviewed other artists that had known him. And so I have now about 60 to 70 interviews on tape about Edvard Munch himself. And one of the things that really intrigued me was that he loved children, and the people that had known him when they were children talked about how he used to sit down on the floor and do little sketches for them and tell them jokes and go out for walks with them and their parents. And he was not the sort of man that I thought many people had labeled him as in those days. And the story about Eva Mudoci, Evangeline Muddock, in getting to know or being introduced to people that had a connection with Munch, there was an exhibition of Munch, and I forget the name of the museum right now, but it was on Long Island. A woman with white hair standing next to Eva Mudoci's portrait. And somebody introduced me, and she said, "I think I am the granddaughter of Edvard Munch." And I was rather startled because, as far as I knew, Munch had no children at all of his own. And so I said, "May I please come and interview you?" And it turned out she was a Catholic nun, Sister Janet Weber, and this was 1983. I went up to Connecticut where she was and interviewed her. A very interesting story. Her grandmother, Eva Mudoci, the violinist, had had illegitimate twins in Denmark in 1906. She left the twins with the obstetrician to be brought up. She continued her violin career. When the First World War came along, she picked up the twins and brought them back to England. She was English. If she introduced them to anybody, it was always as my godchildren, and their name was something entirely different from her name. So it was a big mystery. Well, I asked Janet at one point, we became quite close friends, and I said, "Do you mind if when I take tours through our house and talk about Edvard Munch through a slideshow, may I say that possibly she had children who were, and Edvard Munch was the father?" And Janet said, "Oh yes, you certainly can talk about it." Well, with one group, a Norwegian television reporter heard my story. He came back to me, he said, "Could I possibly interview Janet Weber?" And I said, well, I don't know. I'd have to ask her. So I called her up on the telephone, and she said, oh, yes, I'd be perfectly willing. She came down to Washington and stayed with us for several days while this was going on. The broadcast was broadcast in Norway, and it's created quite a furor, I understand, and is still being looked into. Janet Weber has a family. She's British, she's not American, so her family is in England. And then there's the descendants of Munch's brother, the only descendants in the Munch family who still live in Norway. So they've been corresponding. The question is, will there be a DNA testing? Well, neither family is quite ready for this. So it's an ongoing story, and we may know eventually whether Munch actually did have children.
Interesting.
So on the 150th, there's still things we don't know about Edvard Munch.
That's right. Hard to believe, but endlessly rich. Nelson, I know because I've listened to you that you have some great stories about running after prints, acquiring things, and I wondered if you could tell us some of the most exciting experiences you've had tracking down some of the most special things in your collection.
Well, before I was married and had children, I was probably a little more obsessional. So Pat Berman, nobody's mentioned this, but Pat Berman's first catalog was a show in Palm Beach, Florida, West Palm Beach, the Norton Museum. And I saw a show, and Corey Bernstein had this print there called The Night on Carl Johan. Hopefully it's a unique print, because if one ever comes up again, selfishly, I'd sort of be a little dissatisfied. So after the show, I loaned some things. It was mostly Sally's collection, and I made a loan. I don't know how many or what it was. And I had to have this Night on Carl Johan. And I called Corey Bernstein once every 2 weeks for 2 years. And finally, I said, Corey, you have to sell this to me. And I flew to Fortnum Mason in London, and I offered him this ridiculous, outrageous price for it. And he said, you know, Nelson, I have to sell it to you, but there's one other thing you have to do for me. You have to go over to Marlborough Gallery and buy me a Kitai. He wanted a Kitai, and I was collecting Kitai at the time. So that was probably my most obsessional thing. I've also done that with Kirchner and Johns too, but I guess with Munch, that was my most obsessional. Until I got married, these were my kids. My objective today in life is, I like living with these things, but I have probably a different philosophy than a lot of people. I want my kids to have their own collecting, their own life. They like art. They've been influenced by my collection, but I think probably when I was single and I didn't have a family, I wanted to be remembered because of my art collection, and I really have no interest in that anymore. I want to be remembered by my wife and family as being a good guy, and it's been great to meet particularly, well, collectors, but more importantly because I was not raised intellectually. The directors and the curators of museums, whenever I go to Europe, have been wonderful to me, and it's like traveling with friends. So it's transformed my life. The other obsessional thing, I didn't have a scream, and everybody said, you'd come to your apartment, I don't have a scream. And most of the people that come to my apartment today, because I'm not in the art business, they don't know who Edvard Munch is. They know Picasso, they know maybe Munch before Johns, and certainly Kirchner, not as much as Johns or Munch. But I didn't have a scream, and I went to an auction in London in 1983 or 82, and I didn't sleep the night before because I wanted that scream, and I didn't know how much it was going to cost. And I got the scream, but strangely enough, even though I loaned it here, it's the scream, but it's it's just it's the most iconic and second most reproduced image in the world. But if I had to really collect Edvard Munch, I'd collect his woodcuts. I mean, you have to have a scream. I know Lynn has a scream, Sally has a scream, every collect has a scream, but to me, it's not such a hot thing, unless it's Leon Black's scream. That's at MoMA. So I've had a lot of fun, but I used to think they were my kids, and my kids are my real kids, so whatever goes down now, it's in the hands of my family. It's an awful thing to say, but I'm not collecting for a museum. I want to do more with other philanthropy, you know, medicine, Jewish kids in Belarus. I'm in a different spot in life now, so that's where I'm coming from.
How about you, Sally?
Well, when we first started collecting, we bought some of our Munch prints for our children. As time went on and our collection got bigger, we began to realize it was like a study of Munch. All sorts of different images from late in his life, early in his life. And we talked with our children and decided that the entire collection, plus the interviews I'd been doing and the catalogs I'd been collecting, they should all go to the National Museum in Washington, D.C. So that is it. They're in a foundation now, and every year I have to choose maybe 3 or 4 of my prints that are hanging at home or stored in the attic to go to the National Gallery. And it's sort of like almost trying to decide which children you're going to send off into the wider world. And that's what our collection will, that's where our collection will end up.
Well, that reminds me, too, of the way of the designation from the Order of St. Olav, talking about how you have spread knowledge and appreciation for Munch all over. And can you tell us something about how you have lectured widely, how you welcome people, including my students, frequently over to your house, and how that's developed for you? I had students who went to Sally's house once. She received them with such kindness, and someone wrote later, I had no idea that a collector could be so nice. So got lots of, so tell us about that a bit.
Well, I always enjoy, Edvard Munch said at one point, he said he wanted to share how people feel, that all people go through the emotions that he pictures, and he wants them to know that they're not alone. They can have death, they can have sadness, they can have love affairs, as he did. And so I sort of feel I am spreading what Edvard Munch himself wanted to spread. I don't know if that answers it or not, but I love to have young people come, and I learn a tremendous amount because sometimes people will notice things in one of his prints that I had never focused on before, and so I have a wonderful discussion with somebody who's looking at it for the first time. I have looked at it many, many times, but I've never seen what that person saw. One of the examples for that would be 2 women on the shore, and this would be an old woman sitting on a rock, sort of bowed over, and a young woman standing up straight, looking out to sea. And this person looked at it and said, I don't think that's 2 people. I think that's 1 person. That's the old woman, and she's remembering herself as she was a young girl looking ahead at life. So.
Very meaningful. Nelson, what's your favorite print in your collection?
It used to be the one I didn't have. I think the Weeping Woman Picasso, the Night on Carl Johan, Munch, and a couple of Kirchner Berlin street scenes. And I have a couple of Jasper Johns monotypes that are really fantastic, and it stretched my imagination that I didn't have to all of a sudden have a person. But I think the most interesting thing about collecting whether Munch was, I didn't know Munch. I used to make the pilgrimage to Oslo to the Munch Museum. But the most interesting thing that you can get caught up with, and And it wasn't a good thing for me. I got very friendly with Jim Stein. I watched him paint. He drew me. I got very friendly with Kitai. I bought stuff from him. And the hardest thing to do is separate your friendship from his ability to paint or draw. And that's what I respect in art dealers and curators. Because one day I woke up and I said, I don't want these Jim Steins and I don't want these Kitais. Now what am I going to do? You know? So I donated the most to the Israel Museum, I think, in Jerusalem. But you learn a lot collecting. And it's really enhanced my life. And without being facetious, though, I know Lynn and Sally are going in a different direction. Maybe if I had a painting collection, I would think more of a museum, but in some way, maybe it's through my therapy, I don't want to be in the basement of a museum the rest of my life. But I've had a great time, and I know a lot of you people here, and it's changed my life. Unlike Sally, though, I would like to interview, and I guess they're still alive, I'd like to interview Willie Mays and Arnold Palmer. Because my first love to this day is sports, but art collecting made me something I never thought I would be. You know, I never thought I would be in this, whatever this world is, and most of the time I'm proud of it. My wife was president of Art of Space. She has a great eye. She introduced me to a collection. We have a Wiener Werkstatt silver and furniture, and I guess she has better values than I, because I had to have art, and she can live with art by going to a museum.
Can I go back for just a minute? Very early in our collecting, we did have a copy of the Scream, and I had a high school group come one time, and the girl walked right up to it, and she said, "Oh, I know what that is. That's that young Vietnamese girl running out of her burning village." I mean, Munch is so relevant to life. Now, give me your question again.
I was asking, since you're always involved with a new Munch-related project, if you had something else that you were busy with at the moment.
Well, my husband and I are very involved in international family planning. So if we're not traveling to a Munch exhibit, we may be traveling to Ethiopia or Brazil or one of the developing countries to look into contraceptives and what's available for women. And we're working very hard to get a new sterilization project through the FDA and being very stalled about it. But I'm not going into that. That's difficult. But speaking of contraception, at one point I interviewed a historian in Fredrikstad in Norway who knew the Jolstad family, which was Munch's mother's family. I found out that Munch's mother was one of 7 children of a sea captain and his wife. The sea captain went to sea one time. When he came back, 4 of the children had died of some, whatever it was that went through. The sea captain married again and had 16 children with his second wife. This made me realize that Munch was not an isolated person at all. He had dozens and dozens of cousins. From one of the descendants of Peter Andreas, Munch's younger brother, I got a copy of Peter Andreas's diary for 2 years as a young teenager, talking a lot about what he and Munch did. They went out to pick flowers. They bought a pipe for the father's birthday. He obviously led what was a very normal young boy's life, not a very depressed one. Deaths from tuberculosis were very frequent. Probably every family had deaths. I know in my own family, who lived in Vermont during the years just before the Civil War, my grandmother's 3 older sisters all died of tuberculosis. So we live in a very different life than an era than Munch did, and I've been fascinated in interviewing all these people to find out what life really was like in those days.
Were you going to add something, Nelson?
I have a
Use
scream.
your microphone.
Obviously, I have a scream. And my little 3 or 4-year-old daughter used to come home and go, ah-ee, ah-ee, because she didn't, you know, it was a very frightening thing. But most people have, I know Sally has her foundation for
The National Gallery?
No, not that. The one I like
Oh, for
more.
family planning?
Family planning. But I'll tell you what I would think would be terrific, and I never did it, and I'm not going to do it. But, well, maybe I'm going to do it. I met Katie Gans, and she's the daughter of the Ganses who collected Picasso and Johns early on. And I think, I'm not discrediting myself. I think if you have a good eye, I have a lousy ear for music, but I had a very good eye. I can walk in a gallery and I think still, if I don't know the artist, pick out the best art of an artist. But I think what the coolest thing I could do, and I just don't have the guts to do it, is to do what the Ganses did, buy artists unknown when they're 20 years old. When you can buy Jasper Johns in 1956 and take a shot with him. What Lynn and Phil and Sally have done, and what I've done, I think is remarkable. But I think what the most remarkable thing is to build a collection like Albert Barnes did, and I just went to the Barnes Museum, or what the Ganses did. That's really going out on the line and testing your ability to see something that 20 or 30 or 40 years from then, what's it really all about? But I'm 72, I guess I'm not going to do that.
The exhibition, Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Image, is really the inspiration that Parry Stave had about a year ago. And it was prompted to a certain extent by similar, not totally similar, but somewhat similar exhibitions which were presented in Norway and Denmark. Parry is a consulting curator here at ASF, and we're very fortunate that she has been. She comes with a distinguished background. She is and has been for quite a long time curator for the AXA collection, which was originally called the Equitable Collection. In that position, she organized a great many exhibitions for the Equitable Gallery, which are still fondly remembered by art lovers throughout New York. She came into the ASF universe 3 years ago, I guess, when she agreed to be a coordinating curator for our centennial exhibition, Luminous Modernism, Scandinavian Art Comes to America in 1912, which I mentioned earlier, which was the curator in charge of that was Pat Berman. Since then, Parry has organized 2 additional exhibitions here at Scandinavia House. Unnatural Formations, 3 contemporary photographers, which was presented a year ago, and more recently, Saga Sites, Landscapes of the Icelandic Sagas, which was presented this fall. She also was the co-curator of the exhibition which just preceded this, which was New Wave Finland Photography from the Helsinki School, which she co-curated with Timothy Persons. She has done, I think, an admirable job, along with Pat Berman, in bringing together this exhibition. She's worked closely also with Ariana Tiziani of the ASF staff, and I have only the greatest praise for her, and I would like to, I should also mention, she was extremely active in organizing and making this a reality, the catalog, which if you haven't had a chance to see it, I encourage you to see it, and you can buy it too. And if you're a member, you get a member's discount. So anyway, please welcome Parry Stave, who will introduce our other participants. Parry?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for coming. An exhibition like this can only be done through the kindness of lenders. And so I'd like to reiterate, or at least say for the first time myself, my thanks to Nelson Blitz, Sally Epstein, Ronald and Freda Feldman, Jordan Schnitzer, and Henrietta Dedekind. Henrietta Dedekind is more than just a lender to the exhibition, and she has lent 8 works very generously. But she did come all the way from Norway to be with us today, and she's very much, for me anyway, an inspiration for this exhibition, having instigated the first iteration of a similar exhibition at the Louisiana Museum in Denmark in 2010. So Henrietta, thank you very much for being here with us today. I also want to thank the Munch Museum and to Stein Olav Henrichsen in particular, because he was an early supporter of this endeavor, and it could never have reached the level of quality that it is today had he not early on promised that we would have loans from the museum. Also the Andy Warhol Museum Wellesley College, the Museum of Modern Art, and lastly, I'd like to thank the Andy Warhol Foundation because they provided a great deal of support and background material for the loans and seeking collectors. Since the previous panel talked about collecting Munch, I thought we could focus a little bit about the market for Warhol, this market that's ever growing and expanding, and to get insight from two experts in the field, one in the field of the marketplace, Mary Bartow, on why it is that these images are so appealing to us and to collectors, and to hear from Dr. Reva Wolf second, to talk about the strategies Munch used in his, Warhol used in his image making that make these works so appealing to us. So, to begin with, I'd like to introduce Mary Bartow to you. We're going to have a little bit of a different format. Each speaker will give a short talk, and from then on, I will ask some questions of them. Mary Bartow, our first panelist, is Senior Vice President of Sotheby's and head of the Department of Prints. Since joining Sotheby's print department in 1980, Mary has overseen sales of both European and American 19th and 20th century prints, and is also in charge of sales for the Impressionist and modern prints. She has been responsible for cataloging the works of Mary Cassatt, Winslow Homer, Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, and James A. McNeill Whistler, among others. In addition, she has worked on the auctions of Audubon's The Birds of America for the family of Lord Caledon in 1983, and for the Archives of the City of New York in 1985, and for the George Peabody Library of Johns Hopkins University in 1989. She graduated with honors from Smith College and obtained a master's degree in art history from Johns Hopkins University as a Katzenellenbogen scholar specializing in Northern European art. Mary.
Thank you. First, I'm going to plug the book because what I do is sell. And this book, I unfortunately only got to read it once, but I'm going to read it again because I thought that the essay was so spot on, really good. And the cover, just to show you the cover. This is the Warhol print, and then overlaid is the Munch print, and it's the way it should be. Munch should be on top. And one other quick thing. Recently, I guess you've all heard about the huge price for the Munch Scream at my auction house at Sotheby's, which was $119 million. And it did go to a private collector, and it's now in view at MoMA. But recently, in March, a print sold in London at Christie's for over $3 million, very small aquatint, which is the second highest price ever for a print. The first was Picasso. But this print, I think, was worth every single penny. I usually tell my clients not to look at what things cost, not to buy things for what they're worth as an investment. But in this case, especially if you compare it to $119 million, this was a beautiful work of art, maybe not so important in image, but a beautiful work of art, and I think it was a really well-earned price. I just wanted to get that in about a print making an awful lot of money recently. So I'm very different from most of you. My background is maybe similar, but what I do for a living is very different. I'm a merchant. I come from an art historical background, and in many ways I do look at art the way all of these wonderful art historians do. But I am trained and I am paid to put dollar amounts on works of art and to sell them for the highest possible price. When I first got to Sotheby's, I was just out of graduate school, and my first week there, a Dürer print, a woman came in with a Dürer print and a Chagall print. And lo and behold, the Chagall print was worth $20,000 and the Dürer print was $1,500. I couldn't understand that. I found that was wrong. It was unethical. You know, here's the greatest artist, the artist who brought the Renaissance to Northern Europe, and it's not worth as much as a Chagall. Well, that was my introduction into the market. And the market is what, in most cases, what public taste dictates. So what I'm going to do today is go through these 3 images that are upstairs and tell you what they've brought at auction in the last 10, 15 years, and then tell you why I think they have brought what they've brought. I'm not going to so much talk about Munch, but I will bring him into it. These series of prints were never editioned. I think Pat went into this. They were meant to be editioned, but never were. So the only prints that remain from this process were artist proofs in different color combinations, so each one is unique. That said, we have done a little bit of research, and there were as few as 50 and as many as 65 made. So they aren't particularly rare, though the public, the consensus that people think is that they are rarer than many of his other prints, because he did editions of usually 200 at least. But these are around. So the first one is the Madonna and Self-Portrait. In 2000, it was selling for about no more than $10,000. In 2006, around $20,000. And 2011, it sold twice for between $275,000 and $300,000. That is partly because the Warhol market has exploded since around 2000. It's gone steadily upward. It took a slight dip during the recession, but only for about 6 months. And prices are currently as high, if not higher, for many Warhol prints and paintings. The Eva Madoki, which is the brooch, the very sexual, luxurious Munch lithograph, is the next one, and that was also bringing around $10,000. In 2008, it brought over $200,000. 3 were offered last year at around $200,000 to $300,000. Only one of them sold. I will come back to that, why I think that is happening, actually. And the last one is the Scream. The Scream, again, when it started to come on the market, was for about $10,000, and one sold for $700,000, and it has been coming down more and more. It's now, the last one which was offered was in New York with an estimate of $250,000 to $350,000. And it sold to one bid for $250,000. So why do I think the market for these late Warhols isn't necessarily what the market for early classic Warhols is? And it's my opinion, but I think I can use these prices to sort of just to illustrate what I think. First of all, Munch was as great, in my opinion, as great a printmaker as he was a painter. And Warhol did not exploit the print medium so much. He used reproductive methods, which Pat went into, and exclusively used silk screens on canvas as well as on paper. And silk screens are a very, not just a reproductive medium, but also a very flat medium that I do not think that it permits the artist to show much emotion and much involvement in the printmaking process. And that's where I think Munch certainly exceeds. When the Scream started to rise up and up and up, mainly in London, the Warhol Scream, Sotheby's London kept getting one in each sale, and the first one sold for $600,000, and the second one sold for $700,000, and then all of a sudden it dropped. These were all being consigned by the same person, and they were being purchased by Norwegians and Germans only. No Americans, no Asians. And what we think happened was horrors. The market was manipulated, probably by the consignor or friends of the consignor, to bring the prices up to this astronomical level of what a Munch print brings. $700,000 is the highest that a single Warhol print has ever made on paper. And there I do think that it would be a long time until another one comes in that range. It's a lot of money for, as the word is, the PC word, for an appropriated image. I think the Warhol market is extraordinarily strong for his classical images, which are if you remember the soup cans and the Mao, and the most famous, of course, being the Marilyn or the flowers. And I think he exploited images. He took images from other sources, and those are from other sources that weren't necessarily from art. And those are the ones that the market, the public, seems to want and pay extra for. The ones that he took from Munch, I think, are not so successful as prints. So I'm going to end quickly because I can come back to this, and I have lots of questions.
That's mine.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But I'm going to end with saying that Munch was a great image maker and a great print maker. Warhol was a great image maker. And I think the market shows that. And for prices are much higher for great Munchs than they are for great Munch prints than they are for great Warhol paintings. Prints. Let's not. You don't have to clap now.
I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Reva Wolf. Reva is a professor of art history at the State University of New York at New Paltz, where she has been since 1996, and where in 2011 SUNY acknowledged her work by bestowing on her the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. She received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts and wrote her dissertation on Francisco Goya and the interest in British art and aesthetics in late 19th century Spain. She has published widely on the subject of Goya, but it is because of her work on Andy Warhol that she has been invited to take part in this panel today. She is the author of Andy Warhol, Poetry and Gossip in the 1960s, published in 1997 by the University of Chicago Press, and she contributed to the introduction to the book I'll Be Your Mirror, the collected Andy Warhol interviews. She has numerous articles and essays on Warhol, his interviews, films, portraits, and photographs, among other things. And notably, Reva has been an ardent defender of Andy Warhol's legacy in her support of the important authentication work initiated by the Andy Warhol Foundation.
Thank you so much, Perry, and I just want to thank you and Pat for inviting me to participate in this inviting me to participate in this symposium. It really is a great honor to be here today, and your exhibition is spectacular. I've learned so much through it and through your very fine catalog as well. And coming here to speak today gave me an opportunity to look at a body of work by Warhol that I've never really studied. So this was very exciting for me, and as I thought about these extraordinary images, let's see if I can get this to work, that Warhol made based on Munch's prints, which we've already seen several instances of earlier this afternoon, I began to think about this work in the broader context of Warhol's activities in the 1980s, and especially his appropriation of other works of art. And one of the things that started to interest me as I continued to look at and think about these works is how many times Warhol looked at European art, European paintings, and took those over and redid them. And I found this was fascinating because, of course, Warhol made his name for himself for creating images that were quintessentially American. The soup can, Marilyn Monroe, most notably. And so, and of course, Europe loved that, and Europeans were among the earliest collectors of Warhol's work. And I would say that it is as if to repay the compliment, as he moves forward in time, he then does these works that are really homages to some of the great masterpieces of European art over the centuries. And those indeed include these wonderful prints after Munch's own printmaking experiments. And so I started to think about why it was Warhol did this. And of course, there's a simple answer that probably is already coming to many of your minds, which is that, you know, Warhol's the business artist, and this is, these are commissions, and this is a good business enterprise to do this sort of thing. But I also thought it would be interesting to try to shift the focus a little bit and think in a different way about what might have motivated Warhol and his associates to agree to such commissions at this moment in time in the 1980s. And one interesting way I'd like to propose for framing this kind of work is to understand it as, shall I say, a form of diplomacy, a way of creating interactions between peoples of different countries, much like the way we often think of ourselves as diplomats when I take a trip to another country and interact with people elsewhere. I have a bit of that feeling, and that's part of the excitement of traveling, of meeting people from other places. And I think for Warhol, that was very much part of what was going on here. So here I'd like to then move forward to one of the first works of the 1980s that Warhol did in the arena of printmaking that is based on an earlier European painting. And this is based on the original you see here, Tischbein's portrait of Goethe in the Roman Campagna of 1787. And Warhol very interestingly focuses in on the head of Goethe and really just eliminates all of the context. There's no landscape, no clothing, is to make the person timeless, or perhaps even of his own time, to make him speak to us in our own time, shall we say. And the same is true of the next series I'd like, oh, there we are. This is one of a series of works Warhol did in 1984, Details of Renaissance Paintings. And here too, he is taking an earlier work of European art, very famous work, Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus of 1482, and he is eliminating all of the sort of detail that tells us what this story is, this mythological story, and is just focusing in on the head, remaking it using these extraordinary, this extraordinary range of colors, and even including a black Venus. And then that's interesting to look at, I think, too, in terms of the Munch works, which he's actually working on at the same time, because clearly he's very fascinated by the hair in all of these images. And in focusing in the blowing hair of the Botticelli is a very important detail of that painting, which a lot has been written about, actually. He's focusing in on that. And then, of course, Mudoci, her hair is surrounding her whole body. And then, of course, the Madonna, again, this very important aspect of the hair. And this was the early to mid-1980s when a lot of women were wearing big hair. So again, on one level, there is a connection being made between the past and the present through interesting cropping techniques. Then the next artist I want to turn to is Giorgio de Chirico, very interesting case. And de Chirico and Warhol knew each other already in the 1970s, but it wasn't until the 1980s when Warhol did a series of paintings in 1982 based on de Chirico's paintings. This is a very interesting case, and in certain ways similar to the case of Munch, because de Chirico had this unusual practice of going back and making paintings based on the compositions of his earlier paintings, which was a lot like what Munch did, in fact, in both painting and printmaking practices. So another similarity is that we see that de Chirico and Warhol knew each other. This is a photograph from 1972 taken in Rome for a long time before Warhol started to make these works. And he obviously had thought about this work for a long time. It wasn't just a casual slapstick thing, which is what I'm afraid people do tend often to think when they think of this late work of Warhol. And the same, in a funny way, can be said of Munch, because as is pointed out in the exhibition catalog, Warhol had traveled to Oslo in the early 1970s and had gone to the Munch Museum and had looked at a lot of Munch's work. And it was only at a much later point in time, over 10 years later, that he did his own re-envisionings of Munch's work. So again, there is almost a relationship developing with that artist over a period of time, a period of digestion, and here's just another example of the De Curico. This is Hector and Andromache of 1982, and I show you one of De Curico's versions of that painting as well. And I think this is an interesting example, too, because of the mechanistic-looking figures here. And one of Warhol's most famous lines from an interview of 1963 is, "I want to be a machine." And it's almost as if he is selecting images that really do connect to his own background and past. I also would like to think about the way in which these appropriations occur at a moment in time in New York City when a lot of artists are thinking about appropriation, and the word appropriation even is first starting to be circulating and used within the New York art world. And perhaps most blatant of all of these is Mike Bidlow, who did copies of many artists' works. You see on your right a photograph of Bidlow's studio with various copies, including Silver Marilyn Monroe's, several of which he signed and gave away in 1984 when he did an installation that you see a picture of there on your left, Not Andy Warhol's Factory, in which he's actually dressing up as Andy Warhol, has recreated Warhol's factory, and is kind of playing this charade. So I think this is an excellent and extremely obvious example of this kind of appropriation activity that became very popular among artists in the 1980s. But there were also artists who worked, shall we say, more conventionally with appropriation, that is, absorbing elements of other artists' works, and who were very much involved in those processes in this same decade. Including in that group certainly is Jasper Johns, whom we've already learned about today, and we already saw the Savarin lithograph of 1981, and we also heard mention of it. So I'd like to return to that work, and we saw how for that work Johns put that skeleton arm in Munch's self-portrait at the bottom underneath his can of paintbrushes there that he had redone various times. He, like Warhol and like Munch, is an artist who loves to rework his motifs over and over again. And I started to wonder what connections might exist between Johns and Warhol, because in fact these two artists had known each other for some decades by this point. And already in the 1950s, that's not from the 1950s, that's from the 1970s, but already in the 1950s, both of them worked in the commercial art world in New York City, and Jasper Johns was one of Warhol's most important models and heroes. This is a fascinating Polaroid photograph from the 1970s. We don't have an exact date for it. That recently came to light. It was sold this past fall at Christie's. Apologies for mentioning your competitor, Mary. And I was kind of surprised when I saw this photograph because it has an element of tenderness to it that one doesn't really associate with Warhol and Johns based on what's been written, but for whatever reasons, when this particular photograph was made, there was some sort of tender exchange that occurred. In thinking more about their relationship and whether that might have, for whatever reasons, had something to do with Warhol's own interest in the art of Munch, I started to think about why Warhol put these two different images by Munch together, the self-portrait and the Madonna. And I think Pat Berman is right on that there is a holy family that he is creating through this merger. And also perhaps on another level, I think he may be creating a dialogue with his colleague and hero, Jasper Johns. And here I show you a very famous Jasper Johns painting called Between the Clock and the Bed of 1981, the same year as the lithograph, in caustic on canvas. It's 3 separate panels, and it's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, a very large painting. And I show you Munch's late self-portrait Between the Clock and the Bed, obviously being directly referred to by Johns in the title of his work of 1943 in the collection of the Munch Museum in Oslo. And as I looked at that self-portrait, something dawned on me, which is that there is Munch on the left, and then on the right, on the wall, is a nude woman. And it dawned on me that maybe Warhol was actually recreating that self-portrait by putting together the Munch self-portrait and the Madonna, and that he was doing that in part to re-envision Munch's own work, but also to enter into a dialogue with Johns, for whom this self-portrait by Munch was so very important. The religious element that Pat Berman writes about that is so interesting in this work is also, whoops, yeah, thank you. We also see very present in Warhol's late work, as is well known, he did a large number of paintings of the Last Supper in 1986, some of his last works in a variety of different ways. Some are very close to the model, others are, you can see have all kinds of logos and things on them that you can easily read some very interesting symbolism into. And Leonardo da Vinci, of course, is another artist who is a very important part of our popular imagination in the same way that Munch is. And as is well known, one of Warhol's first takeoffs on an old master painting is 30 Are Better Than One of 1963, repetition of the Mona Lisa, and obviously an homage to Marcel Duchamp, among other things. But even in the 1950s, when Warhol was a commercial artist, it didn't quite jump yet into the fine art arena, he often would turn to works of art as models. And an interesting example that very recently my attention was drawn to very recently thanks to an article in the Wall Street Journal is the case of Albrecht Dürer. And because there is right now an exhibition of Dürer's drawings at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., including this drawing of praying hands, I guess that occasioned this revelation that Warhol himself, as you see on the right, in the 1950s, did a variation on Dürer's praying hands, a drawing of the 1950s, using his blotted line technique that was typical of that time. And in fact, those praying hands even grace the tombstone of Warhol in the reverse in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania. The religious element then comes full circle and really runs throughout Warhol's career, we could say. But to conclude, I would like to turn back to this idea of the artist as diplomat. Obviously, Warhol was not an official diplomat. He didn't work for the government. The government, you know, the FBI followed him and tracked him, and quite the contrary. But in a way, he was probably a great diplomat for the United States because of these amazing commissions that he did in collaborations with people all around the world, many of them in Europe. And certainly these Munch works, I feel, fit into that scheme and are why we are here today. So thank you.
Well, thank you, both of you. Mary, I'm stuck on the comparison you made between Munch and Warhol, where you said one was a great painter and printmaker, and the other was a great image maker.
I said Munch was a great image maker and printmaker. Warhol was a great image maker. I don't consider him a great printmaker. As far as taking the great print media and working them and reworking them and reworking them, he used silkscreen, really, or screen prints and photographs.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. Would it be bad manners to disagree?
No, it is my personal taste, but I think also that as I'm here speaking about the market, I think the market also has agrees with what I'm saying. I think a great Munch print will bring much more than a Warhol one. For good reason.
Well, I think that, in a way, Warhol's great innovation in printmaking is really to combine printmaking with painting. So his work on canvas, in other words, in which he uses the photosilk screen process, and I think in that way he was an extraordinarily innovative printmaker and is very important to the history of printmaking. But he's doing that, he's breaking down the barriers as we know them between various media, so it kind of confuses the issue.
Right.
which is why he's so interesting to me, because he likes to do that. He likes to confuse
He's
the
definitely
issue.
interesting. I'm not saying he isn't interesting.
Oh, I didn't think
no,
you
no.
were.
I'm just. It's more of what I feel. These are worth monetarily, because that's really what I was asked here to speak about, and rather than art historically, I think he's extremely, probably the most important artist of the 20th century, in a way more than Picasso. Not as a great printmaker, Picasso's a better printmaker, but I think for me it's about making and creating prints, and using those techniques in different ways. His paintings are basically prints.
Right.
So in that context, they are almost, well, getting close to being comparable. If you think of what the value of the paintings after Munch have
On canvas.
Yes, exactly.
On canvas they bring, yes, quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
On paper, not so.
So I've developed a few questions as prompts to discussion, and one of them is this. In one of the catalogues raisonné of Warhol's prints, there's a gem of an essay by Henry Gallagher, who knew Warhol, and he was writing about the Hammer and Sickle series of prints from the late 70s, and the irony that these highly charged symbols of communism were avidly collected by wealthy capitalists and shown above their sofas or whatever. And he asks these questions, which I'd love your comments on. By their presence and non-committal presentation, we are forced once again to inquire as to the artist's intentions. Is he being cynical? Is he kidding? Is he simple? Does he think we're simple? Are we?
I'm going to start because I'm going to answer what my colleague here just said. Maybe he was reaching out to images as a sort of diplomat. Perhaps, and it was still before, I think they were made before the wall came down, for sure, right? Yeah.
Yes, they were.
So I think that's perhaps what he was doing.
In fact, we have a little bit of evidence about what inspired him to do this, and it does connect with the diplomacy theory that I've proposed, and it is a little tongue-in-cheek. There were critics of his work in Europe that interpreted it from a very political perspective, and he once commented, or someone, maybe it was Bob Colacello in his book about Warhol, commented that Warhol started to make these works, the paintings and the prints of the Hammer and Sickle, to please the Italian, his Italian fans, because they especially would write about his work in these political terms, as being kind of, Marxist in certain ways because of the democratic nature of the imagery and the printmaking. And then there's a level of irony in the imagery itself, because it's a hammer and sickle, but they are real hammer and sickles that were taken from, purchased by an assistant, right, and arranged and photographed and then, right, painted, and prints were made of. And they have the brand name. You can read the Champion brand name. I forget if it must be on the hammer, but I can't remember if it's on, I think it's on the hammer, I can't remember, but so there is a lot of irony there. And someone recently actually wrote about this. Warhol often thought a lot about communism and capitalism and their relationship to each other. This was something that really fascinated him, as it fascinated society at large. And in the 1963 interview I mentioned a few minutes ago, in which he talked about wanting to be a machine, he also talked about how in Russia under communism everyone's becoming alike. Here it's happening all by itself. So that connects to those later images too, I think.
So speaking in the context of Warhol's quotations from the world of art history, and earlier than that, the world of advertising, do these represent his resignation in the face of the impossibility of creating anything new?
No.
He did create new things. I mean, look at those. If you look at the exhibition upstairs. They're very new. They don't, to me, they don't look that much at all like Munch. So they're very new.
So he's taking the idea and making it his own.
Absolutely.
And when you look at these Warhol prints after Munch, does it cause you to see the Munchs differently?
Yes, in a better way in my case.
Do you
I'm
want
joking.
to elaborate
I feel,
on that?
and a friend of mine just said this when I was looking at the exhibition with him. He said the first he wasn't even, doesn't look at a lot of Munch and doesn't look at a lot of Warhol. And he said the sensuality and the sexuality is gone when you get to Warhol, and for me, it is a huge part of two of those images, not necessarily the self-portrait, and I think it's this using of a silkscreen versus lithography, which is partly, and it's partly late 19th century versus mid 20th century, and the extreme strong use of color, and particularly in the Scream, instead of those lithographic lines or in the painting or in the pastel, those extremely sensuous, vibrant electric lines, he went off register. And that's really new. I mean, that is using print technique really interesting, in an interesting way for me. Getting those electric lines by being off register.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to pick up on your point about the sort of removal of the sensuality of the original Munchs, because I really think that's the case in many ways. And I think that you see early on in Warhol, like when he did his Marilyn Monroe's, if you look at the original photograph that he used as a model, you see he cropped very close to her face, and he eliminated her chest is in the photograph, as you know, it would have been in a publicity photograph of 1952, 53. And he removed that. He really just focused on the face for a variety of different reasons, and in a way that does remove that part of her sexuality, you know, that part of her body. And so I think there, you know, certainly is that element. On the flip side, too, I was thinking it was interesting that he chose the image of Mudoci. It's not an obvious choice. It's an unusual image, I think, and unusual for us to look at today even. It's a strange composition. But then apparently she had a woman partner. And I'm sure Warhol would have known that. That's exactly the kind of biographical detail that he would have known, and that no doubt he would have been drawn to the image for that reason. But also there were strange elements in the composition that he really highlights with his use of color, the brooch, and this kind of strange triangular form. And if you look at his other images, you often see these weird kind of abstract forms in the middle of a portrait. And even with the Marilyn Monroe, when he crops it, she has this collar, and all you see is just a piece of it, and it just looks like an abstract form next to her neck. It's very interesting. So anyway, I agree with you on that, and it's interesting to think about why he chose those particular images.
I wanted to point out that one of the reasons to your point about printing out of register, one of the reasons that we have in the exhibition Munch's print On the Waves of Love from Nelson Blitz's collection is because it is a double printing. So Munch himself put it through the press twice so that he could create a slightly off-register reverberation between the two sets of lines.
It's very fuzzy, and again, that becomes, but he does that, I think, to make it extremely sensual. You know, where is that? Is she in our space? Is she in the space of the image? And it's, I think, very much done on purpose too.
And yet,
rather than,
and yet we're drawn like moths to flame to Warhol's work. I mean, we can't seem to get enough of it. You know, you go into the room and you're wowed by it. I mean, it's exciting and it's dazzling and.
It's large.
Is that what it is?
It's large. It's colorful. It's images that. Why these images I think have not taken on so much in the marketplace is that his classic images of objects that Brillo pads, the gas stations, the celebrity portraits, as Americans we know much more about those images than we do about Munch, except for maybe the scream. And I think that is a reason why the market has just exploded for this artist, that everyone can understand Warhol. Not everyone can understand Munch. I think part of his wonder is that he's, you know, Mrs. Epstein has spent part of her life trying to understand him. And I think Warhol is initially, maybe not as you start to study him in depth, but initially people think, I get it. I can understand this. I see this image, I know it. Not so much with Munch.
Reva, I'm sure you have something to say about that.
Well, I think that's right, that people can respond and they can think they have a sense of what it's about. That sense of what it's about probably comes in part from ideas circulating around us, because there is a lot circulating around about Warhol, which many people have brought up today. You know, he's all surface, and all of these ideas that he himself perpetuated and promoted, that we then connect to him.
Right.
And that makes him seem very accessible.
Exactly.
So do you not see, I mean, why would Warhol have picked those 4 images, and could there be anything in them that that might have resonated with him in his life, besides the Eva Madoci, as you mentioned?
Yes, but just to answer a question with a question, why did he not edition them? Why didn't he like them enough to make an edition?
Well, here's what I understand about that piece of history, which is that the project fell apart when the owners of the Gallery Berman had a parting of ways. And I think it was the intention of one of the owners to publish the prints later on, or it may have been his intention to do that, at least that's what he told me, but that Warhol died before they could get back to the project.
So he was planning on it. Okay.
That could be.
Yeah.
But it's a good question.
I think one of the things that Pat said earlier on, which was so really hit me, was the self-portrait, and then his fright mass paintings, and I saw and what she was talking about, I saw an incredible that image when you saw it, and I don't think there's a painting like that, is there, of his self-portrait with the dark background? Nothing like that. So that lithograph, I think, is an extremely important self-portrait, and I think Warhol. That's one of the 3 images. I think Warhol truly loved it and appropriated it in a very different way with his late portraits of self-portraits. But I think it was a great comparison that she made.
I agree, and even if you...
Oh, right, yeah. He, Warhol, when we sold, I actually was there for the sale, he owned that lithograph. A very beautiful impression of it, actually. And he had a few other monks, but that was the greatest one that he had. That's correct.
Yeah, and I wanted to just add to what you were saying about Warhol's interest in that particular self-portrait, which is the way in which there's that white band around Munch's neck. And even if you look at some of Warhol's earlier self-portraits, you see there's a dark band here, like the mugshot, 1964, like choking, or, you know.
Clerical comment.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite that with Warhol, but there's a similar sensibility. Yeah. Even earlier. So I'm sure that, I don't know when he first saw an example of that Munch print, but if it was before he made those portraits, there could have been some inspiration. If after, he would have made the association, I'm sure. Because that's a powerful image you see in many of Warhol's portraits, that kind of choking, or really, and again, connecting with death, as Munch does, with the skeleton arm. So that's another important element.
As for the other images, I think the brooch is the one that everyone can understand why he picked the scream. I think it's self-evident. But Eva, and because Eva is so much more of a late 19th century image than the Madonna is. I think the Madonna is much more. It brings in much more, many more 20th century questions and knowledge and science and biology. But the Eva, I would think he picked it maybe just out of its sheer beauty. I think it's very beautiful, and the story perhaps of her having a female lover was interesting to Warhol. It's one of my favorite lithographs of his. It's just beautiful. It's beautiful. What do you think? Why do you think you picked it?
Well, I think, as I already mentioned, the connection and the oddness of the composition, I think, would have fascinated him.